Textual criticism, in terms of how it is practiced, is divided into two broad sections. One is known as external evidence and the other is internal evidence. External evidence has to do with an examination of the data that are out there, the hard data, the manuscripts, the versions, and the father's writings. Internal evidence has to do with what you might call the soft data, which has to do with what an author would likely have written and what would the scribes be likely to have done. Although both of those are of virtually equal importance, they do come at the problem of the text in different ways, and we need to combine their efforts to see how we view a particular textual variant in terms of whether it's authentic or not. When it comes to external evidence, it has three components. One is the date and character of the manuscripts. The second is known as genealogical solidarity, and the third is known as geographical distribution. Date and character has to do with an examination of each individual manuscript in terms of when it was written and in terms of how good of a witness it is to its own group of manuscripts within which it exists. Now, that group of manuscripts sometimes is known as text types, others call them families, and there's other scholars that are moving away from this kind of terminology altogether. But nevertheless, when we look at a manuscript, one of the considerations that we have is what is the date of the manuscript, and generally speaking, we would say that the earlier the manuscript, the more likely it is to go back to the original wording of the text. So date is an important factor. Coupled with this is the character of the manuscript. Is this manuscript a good representative of the textual family to which it belongs? And we can check that out by comparing it with some of these other manuscripts that belong to that textual family. Obviously, if a manuscript is both early and is considered to be a good witness to that textual family, then we'd say that that is an important manuscript. Now, some manuscripts don't naturally yield themselves into a particular family of manuscripts at all, but they are still early, and it's hard to pigeonhole them as to where they belong, but they are significant manuscripts in their own right because of their date. Codex Washingtoniensis in Washington, D.C. is one of these manuscripts, a late 4th, perhaps early 5th century manuscript, as some have dated it. Other scholars have dated it much later to the 7th century, and a couple of scholars have dated it significantly earlier than 4th or 5th century. But it's a manuscript that doesn't quite naturally fit into any one of these textual families, but because of its most likely early date, it has some significance all on its own. Now, so the date and character is an important thing. Now, one of the considerations we have to look at on this is just because a manuscript is early does not necessarily mean that it's going to be an important witness to the text of the New Testament. For example, a scribe may have been sloppy in his copying practices. He may have been copying, say, 3 or 4 words at a time instead of a couple of letters at a time. We know, for example, that the scribe of P66, a late 2nd century document, was one who was far more interested in calligraphy, in making pretty letters on his manuscript, than he was in accurately transmitting the text that was in front of him. Meanwhile, another scribe, the scribe of P75, which is probably an early 3rd century, possibly a late 2nd century manuscript. There the scribe looks as if he's making a personal copy. The manuscript is not nearly as clean as P66. It looks almost kind of like chicken scratches. But this scribe is very careful to write out the exemplar in front of him, and consequently he's writing 1 or 2 letters at most at a time, and so the kinds of mistakes he makes are those that are typically nonsense errors and transpositions where he inverts one letter in the place of the other. So instead of spelling cat, C-A-T, he might have spelled it C-T-A, and consequently those are the kinds of mistakes we have. So date and character is important, but again, an early manuscript where the scribe is not careful, and especially if he knows Greek well and intentionally changes the text, is not going to be as valuable as a scribe who is careful or who makes the kinds of mistakes that are easily detectable. Generally speaking, those kinds of mistakes that end up with nonsense readings are to be preferred to the ones that make sense, because it's easier to see, oh, this scribe meant to write X instead of Y. When a scribe is intentionally changing the text, it's very difficult to tell what the manuscript in front of him actually said. Now, there are some manuscripts that come further down the line that are every bit as valuable as the early manuscripts. And this is where the date of a manuscript does not become nearly as important. The classic example is Codex 1739, a manuscript that is of medieval age, and it's on the peninsula of Mount Athos in northeastern Greece, where 22 monasteries are located. No woman has legally set foot on this peninsula for a millennium. Codex 1739 is a document that is extremely significant because here the scribe, Ephraim was his name, was a scribe who tried to find the earliest possible manuscript he could to copy from. And we have evidence of some of his other writings. Codex 1582 is another one that he wrote out, and he wrote out some classical texts as well. He was very careful to find the earliest and the best copies he could. And the ancestor that he apparently directly copied from in the 10th century was a manuscript that comes from the late 4th or early 5th century. So there's no intervening copies between what this scribe wrote and what his ancestor says. So Codex 1739 becomes a manuscript that we would consider to be as important as a late 4th or early 5th century manuscript of the Greek New Testament. Very important. But that's the exception that proves the rule. Normally, the earlier the date, the more important the manuscript. Now, when it comes to the character of the manuscripts, again, we say that the better a witness is to the textual family that it belongs to, this gives it good character. This is important for us to consider. One of the things we can determine about these manuscripts is through a number of processes, we can pretty much determine how a scribe copied out his or her text, whether it was word for word, letter for letter, or large phrase for large phrase. And some of them copied out the text by sense phrases, this kind of a thing. But the character of the manuscript is based both on the fact that we're dealing with a manuscript that is a good witness to its textual family, and the way in which it copied its exemplar was one in which it did not get too creative and go off in some different directions, but may have made nonsense errors or minor changes from what that exemplar's text said. In other words, the scribe was a faithful scribe trying to copy what the manuscript in front of it actually was saying. The second area of external evidence is known as genealogical solidarity. If the best witnesses of a particular text form agree with each other on the reading or the textual variant, then we would say that there is a pretty decent genealogical solidarity. By genealogical, what we mean is, if you think in terms of a family genealogy, those members that are close to each other, that have the same parents, the same grandparents, and they all have blue eyes and blonde hair, we'd say these folks seem to have a pretty strong resemblance because of their ancestry. When you're looking at genealogy of manuscripts, when you see a strong resemblance because of their ancestry, and especially if you see it in the manuscripts that are otherwise determined to be both early and significant and good witnesses in terms of their character, we'd say that now we have genealogical solidarity. And the point of the external evidence, the point of all these different steps in textual criticism, in fact, is to try to get back to the earlier reading, namely the autographic text. We have to do so without material evidence to get there. So if I'm looking at, say, 10 manuscripts from the 4th century, if we had that many all reading the same text, that belong to the same family, and 9 of them all say the Lord said, and one of them says the Lord Jesus said in a given text, then we would say most likely that those 9 got it right from their common ancestor, and the 10th one is the renegade who added the word Jesus from some other evidence or for some other reason. So that's genealogical solidarity, where the manuscripts have a strong agreement. We can push back the date of their common reading that we don't have material evidence for. But obviously, the ultimate original date of these readings has to go back to the original New Testament. And we don't have any first century documents, so we have to come up with hypotheses to give us the sense of what that original text really said. The third aspect of external evidence is going to be geographical distribution. If you think of genealogical solidarity as within almost a funnel going through the centuries back to the earliest period of the beginnings of a particular text form, that's genealogical solidarity. If you think of geographical distribution as going wide in terms of the geographical region, but at the same time, you get kind of a cross of a twofold cord that's not easily broken. If I have, say, a bunch of manuscripts and versions and church fathers from the 5th century, and we've got one from the eastern part of the empire, another from the western part of the empire, another one down in the south, maybe another one in some other areas, you've got these manuscripts from the same period, these manuscripts and versions and fathers from the same period, and they agree with each other. That gives us geographical distribution. Now, if the reading is the kind of a reading that is not predictable, that is not the kind that a scribe would normally come up with on his own, and that two scribes in two different locales would independently of one another come up with, then we would have to say, okay, that tells us that the geographical distribution is important, and we can push back the date of their common reading even further than the date of each one of those manuscripts. So these are the three areas of external evidence: date and character of the manuscripts, genealogical solidarity, and geographical distribution. And scholars look at this kind of material evidence and work through the details of each textual problem on the basis of these three criteria to come up with the best estimate they've got as to the date of each reading and when it got into the textual stream on the basis of this external evidence.